The snow had stopped falling 3 hours ago, but Sergeant Klaus Brenner could still taste it on his lips, mixed with gunpowder and something else he did not want to name. He crouched at the edge of a crater that should not exist. Around him, the Ardennes forest looked like God had reached down and torn it apart with bare hands. Trees that had stood for 100 years lay shattered, their white insides exposed like broken bones. And everywhere, in patterns that made no sense, were the dead Klaus had fought since Normandy. He had seen what artillery could do. He knew the mathematics of death: the shell comes down, it hits the ground, it explodes outward, and men die in predictable circles. But this was different. These American soldiers had been killed in their foxholes, struck from above as if by lightning. There were no impact craters beneath them. The shells had exploded in the air, 5 or 6 meters up, showering death downward where no helmet could protect, where no cover could save. It was December 1944, and the great German offensive through the Ardennes had begun with such hope. The Führer promised this would turn the tide. They would split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, force the Americans and British to negotiate. Klaus did not believe in promises anymore, but he believed in his mission. His recovery team was tasked with collecting American equipment, anything that might help German engineers understand the enemy's capabilities. That he found it half buried in the frozen mud, 30 meters from the tree line. An artillery shell, American manufacture, 90 mm by the look of it. The nose cone was cracked open, probably from the cold or the impact of landing without detonating. Klaus wiped the frost away with his glove and stared at what lay inside. He had expected simple mechanics, a timer, perhaps, or a contact trigger. Instead, he saw a tangle of copper wires, tiny glass tubes smaller than his finger, and components that looked like they belonged in a radio set, not a weapon. Klaus had studied engineering for 2 years in Munich before the war took him. He understood machines. He understood that every device had a logic, a purpose written in its construction. But this shell defeated his understanding. It seemed to contain a complete radio transmitter and receiver, miniaturized beyond anything he had seen, designed to survive being fired from a cannon at velocities that would crush ordinary electronics. That he called over his commanding officer, Lieutenant Erich Holtz, a tired man with gray in his beard and doubt in his eyes. Holtz looked at the shell for a long moment. Then he looked at the dead Americans in their foxholes, killed by explosions that came from the sky itself. He made the connection Klaus had already made. "This is how they are doing it," Holtz said quietly. "The shells know when to explode. They sense the target." Within the hour, a motorcycle courier arrived from division headquarters. Word had spread fast. The shell was wrapped in blankets, handled like a sleeping infant, and loaded into a staff car that appeared from nowhere with SS markings on its doors. Klaus watched the car disappear down the frozen road toward Germany. He did not know where the shell was going. He only knew that someone with more authority than Lieutenant Holtz wanted it badly. That night, huddled in a ruined farmhouse with the rest of his squad, Klaus wrote a letter to his younger brother, Martin, who was still studying physics in Munich. The letter would take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. Klaus described what he had seen: the shell that thought for itself, the dead Americans struck down by explosions that came from empty air. He asked Martin a question that had been crawling through his mind all day: how do you fight an enemy whose weapons are smarter than your soldiers? He did not expect an answer. He was not sure there was one. Outside, the artillery had started again. Klaus could hear the distant American guns speaking their strange language, sending shells across the winter sky. Somewhere out there, each of those shells carried a tiny radio, listening, waiting, deciding the perfect moment to kill. Klaus pressed himself against the farmhouse wall and tried not to think about the mathematics of it. Thousands of shells, each one a small mechanical brain, multiplied across the entire Western Front. That he was 23 years old. He had wanted to build bridges. Instead, he had found a weapon that would haunt German scientists for months to come, a weapon that represented not just American firepower but American genius, mass-produced and delivered by the millions. Klaus did not know any of this yet. He only knew that the war had changed today, and not in Germany's favor. He finished his letter, folded it carefully, and tried to sleep while the smart shells fell through the darkness above. The shell sat on a steel table under lights so bright they seemed angry. Dr. Heinrich Voss stood before it with surgical tools in his hands and terror in his heart. He had not slept in 31 hours. The coffee had run out yesterday. The heating system in the underground facility had failed twice this week. And now, in this frozen laboratory hidden beneath a bombed-out factory in Thuringia, he was about to open a device that might explain why Germany was losing the war. It was January 1945. The Ardennes offensive had failed. The Soviets were pushing toward Berlin from the east. The Americans and British advanced from the west. And yet the Reich's leadership still demanded miracles, still believed that German science could produce wonder weapons to reverse the tide. They had sent Voss this shell with orders to analyze it, copy it, and develop countermeasures. They had given him 3 weeks. 3 weeks to duplicate what the Americans had built with unlimited resources, thousands of engineers, and years of development. Voss almost laughed when he read the orders. Almost. Dr. Margarete Linden stood beside him, her notebook ready, her face pale in the harsh light. She was a radio engineer, one of the few women permitted in military research, and she had been pulled from a civilian broadcasting project to assist with this analysis. She knew she was being watched. Everyone in this facility was being watched. Colonel Victor Hauser of the SS sat in the corner of the laboratory, silent, his eyes moving between the scientists and the door. Voss made the first incision into the shell's nose cone. The metal peeled back like flower petals. Inside, he found something that stopped his breath. A complete radio system. Transmitter. Receiver. Power supply. All compressed into a space smaller than a coffee cup. The vacuum tubes were the size of his thumbnail, made of glass so thin it seemed impossible they could survive any impact, let alone being fired from an artillery cannon at velocities exceeding 800 meters per second. Each component was labeled in English with production codes that suggested assembly line manufacture. This was not a prototype. This was not an experiment. This was mass production on a scale Voss could barely comprehend. Linden took the measurements. The shell's internal radio operated on a frequency designed to bounce off solid objects. When fired, it continuously transmitted a signal. When that signal reflected back with sufficient strength, indicating a target within lethal range, the shell detonated. No timer. No physical contact required. The weapon decided for itself when to kill. The Americans called it the VT fuse. Variable time. The Germans had heard rumors of such technology, had attempted their own versions, but had never achieved anything close to this. German proximity fuse programs had produced fragile prototypes that failed in testing. The Americans had produced millions of units that worked. Voss ran the calculations on the G-forces involved. An artillery shell experiences 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired. The electronics inside this shell had to withstand that acceleration instantly, then function perfectly while spinning through the air at supersonic speeds, then detonate at precisely the right moment. Every vacuum tube, every wire, every solder joint had to be perfect. And the Americans had built enough of these to equip their entire artillery corps. "We cannot copy this," Voss said quietly. It was not a complaint. It was not despair. It was simply a statement of fact, spoken to the cold air of the laboratory. Colonel Hauser stood up from his chair. "You will find a way. We lack the manufacturing capacity. We lack the materials. Our factories are being bombed daily. Our supply lines are collapsing. Those are excuses. German science is superior." Voss looked at the American shell. He thought about what superior meant. The Germans had brilliant scientists, yes. They had designed remarkable weapons, jet aircraft, guided missiles, submarines that could stay submerged for weeks. But the Americans had something else. They had the ability to turn brilliance into production. They did not build one miracle. They built 10 million miracles, all identical, all perfect, all deadly. That night, after Hauser had left, Linden found Voss alone in the laboratory. He was holding one of the tiny vacuum tubes up to the light, turning it slowly, studying its construction. She asked what he was thinking, that he answered without looking at her. I am thinking that this tube was made by a factory worker in America. Perhaps a woman. Perhaps she made 100 of these per day. She probably did not know what they were for. And yet each one works perfectly. Each one is a small miracle of engineering, produced by the thousands, shipped across an ocean, loaded into shells, and fired at us. He set the tube down gently. We build masterpieces. They build factories that produce masterpieces. That is the difference. That is why we will lose. Lyndon said nothing. There was nothing to say. The shell sat between them, silent, complete, a message from a future that did not include the Reich. The letter arrived on a gray February morning when the sky above Thuringia was full of American bombers. Dr. Heinrich Voss held the envelope in trembling hands, already knowing what it contained. The handwriting on the front was his sister's. The black border around the stamp told the rest. Klaus Brenner, his nephew, the young sergeant who had found the shell in the Ardennes, was dead. Killed by artillery fire near Bastogne. The family had been notified 3 weeks ago. The letter had taken that long to reach this buried facility. Klaus had been 23 years old. He had wanted to build bridges. Voss sat in his small office, surrounded by papers covered with equations that would never matter, and he thought about the proximity fuse. He thought about how it worked, the radio signal bouncing off targets, the detonation triggered not by impact but by presence, the mathematical certainty of the kill. Klaus would not have heard the shell coming. No one heard them coming. That was the genius of the design. Death arrived from a silent sky, perfectly timed, unavoidable. The war had become personal now. It had always been personal, of course, but Voss had hidden behind his science, behind his calculations, behind the cold comfort of technical analysis. Now his nephew was dead, killed by the very technology that sat on his laboratory table, and Voss could no longer pretend that this was merely an intellectual exercise that he had to write his report for Berlin. The High Command wanted answers. They wanted countermeasures. They wanted hope. Voss had none of these things to offer. He wrote 3 drafts of his report, each one a different kind of lie. The first was honest: the American proximity fuse represents industrial capabilities Germany cannot match. Our attempts to develop countermeasures have failed. The war is lost. He burned this version in his small stove and watched the ashes curl. The second offered false optimism: with sufficient resources and time, German science can develop effective countermeasures within 6 months. This was the report his superiors wanted. It would buy time, secure funding, protect careers. But Voss could not bring himself to send it. He had spent his life in pursuit of truth. He would not abandon that now, not even to save himself. The third version was something between hope and despair. It acknowledged the American advantage while requesting continued research. It was the report of a man trying to survive long enough to see the end of the war. Dr. Margarethe Linden found him that evening, staring at the 3 drafts laid out on his desk. She had her own concerns. The facility was scheduled for relocation. The Soviets were within 200 kilometers of Berlin. The American forces had crossed the Rhine. Everyone in the laboratory knew the Reich was collapsing. Some whispered about escape routes to Switzerland. Others talked about surrendering to the Americans rather than the Soviets. The SS guards had become more numerous, more nervous, more dangerous. Which report will you send? Linden asked. Voss pointed to the 3rd draft. This one. It says nothing and everything. It will satisfy no one, but it will keep us alive for another few weeks. And then? He had no answer. The future had become a fog, thick and impenetrable. All he knew was that the American shells kept falling, each one carrying its tiny radio brain, each one a reminder that Germany had lost the scientific war long before it lost the military one. The proximity fuse project had begun in 1940 at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland. Voss had pieced this together from captured documents, prisoner interrogations, fragments of intelligence. The Americans had assembled teams of physicists, engineers, and manufacturers. They had solved problems that German scientists considered unsolvable: how to make vacuum tubes survive extreme acceleration, how to miniaturize radio components, how to mass-produce precision electronics during wartime. By 1943, the fuse was in production. By 1944, it was deployed across the Pacific and European theaters. The Americans had built more than 20 million units. 20 million. Voss let that number sink into his mind. Germany's entire proximity fuse program had produced fewer than 100 working prototypes, most of which failed in testing. The Americans had built 20 million that worked. He looked at the photograph of Klaus that his sister had included in the letter. A young man in uniform, serious eyes, a slight smile at the corner of his mouth. Klaus had found the shell that revealed America's secret. And then America's secret had killed him. Voss carefully folded the photograph and placed it in his desk drawer. He sealed the third draft of his report, addressed it to the Weapons Development Office in Berlin, and gave it to a courier who would probably never deliver it. The roads were chaos. The railways were bombed. The Reich was dying piece by piece. That night, the bombers returned. Voss listened to them pass overhead, hundreds of aircraft flying towards some target deeper in Germany. He imagined the shells those planes carried, each equipped with its own proximity fuse, each one a small American miracle falling through the darkness. He closed his eyes and waited for morning. The Americans came on a morning washed clean by spring rain. Dr. Heinrich Voss heard the distant rumble of their tanks while sitting alone in the abandoned laboratory, the proximity fuse shell still on the table before him, his notebook open to a blank page. Everyone else had fled. Colonel Hauser had disappeared 3 days ago with a suitcase full of documents, running towards some fantasy of escape or negotiation. The guards had melted away in the night. Dr. Linden had begged Voss to come with her, to surrender together, to face whatever came next as colleagues, as friends. He had refused. There was something he needed to do first. Something he had been unable to do for months while writing false reports and attending meaningless meetings. He needed to tell the truth. It was April 1945. Adolf Hitler was alive in his bunker beneath Berlin, still issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years would barely survive another month. And here, in this silent laboratory carved into the Thuringian hills, one exhausted scientist prepared to record what he had learned. Voss picked up his pen and began to write. He wrote about the shell itself, its elegant design, its miniaturized components, its flawless construction. He wrote about the vacuum tubes that survived forces of 20,000 G, each one manufactured to tolerances German industry could not achieve. He wrote about the radio system that could detect a target in microseconds and trigger a detonation at the optimal moment for maximum lethality, but he wrote about more than technology. He wrote about what the technology meant. The Americans had not merely invented a clever weapon. They had demonstrated a philosophy of war that Germany could never match. They had taken the individual genius of a few brilliant scientists and transformed it into industrial output. They had mass-produced innovation itself. Every proximity fuse rolling off American assembly lines was a small miracle, and they had built those miracles by the millions. Germany had believed in the power of individual brilliance, in the Superman who could achieve what ordinary men could not. The Americans believed in systems, in processes, in factories that could replicate excellence 1,000 times per hour. Germany had built cathedrals. America had built machines that produced cathedrals on an assembly line. Voss wrote until his hand cramped. He wrote about Klaus, his nephew, killed by a weapon he would never have heard coming. He wrote about Linden, who had understood the truth long before she could admit it. He wrote about himself, a physicist who had wasted years serving a regime that mistook cruelty for strength and arrogance for wisdom. His final paragraph was the one he had been circling toward for months. This small device is not merely a weapon. It is a message from a civilization that has learned to multiply genius. The Americans did not win because they had better soldiers or braver commanders. They won because they found a way to make the extraordinary ordinary. They mass-produced miracles. They turned science into industry and industry into an avalanche. Against such a system, no nation built on the cult of individual greatness can stand. We believed that willpower could overcome material reality. This shell is material reality's answer. The rumble of tanks grew louder. Voss heard shouting in English, the crunch of boots on gravel, doors being kicked open. He closed his notebook, set down his pen, and waited. The American soldiers who entered the laboratory were young, tired, dirty from weeks of combat. Their lieutenant was perhaps 25 years old, with a sergeant's practicality in his eyes despite his officer's bars. He found Voss sitting calmly at the table, hands visible, making no threatening movement. "You speak English?" the lieutenant asked. "Yes. I am a scientist. I was analyzing this." Voss gestured to the shell. The lieutenant looked at the device. He had seen 100 like it in the field. To him, it was simply artillery ammunition, something that killed Germans and kept Americans alive. He had no idea that this particular shell had traveled from a frozen battlefield to a secret laboratory, that it had been studied and measured and feared by some of the finest minds in Germany. "What's that?" He pointed to the notebook. "My observations. My conclusions. Everything I learned about this weapon and what it means." Voss offered the notebook with both hands. "Take it. It may be useful to someone. It is useless to me now." The lieutenant took the notebook, flipped through pages of dense German handwriting, and shrugged. He could not read a word. He tucked it into his jacket anyway. Someday, perhaps, someone would translate it. Someday, historians might care what German scientists thought when they finally understood why they had lost. The soldiers led Voss outside. The spring sunlight was warm on his face. The war was over for him. Whatever came next, imprisonment, interrogation, perhaps work for the Americans themselves, as he knew many German scientists would be offered. He did not care. The burden of pretending had finally lifted. Behind him, the laboratory stood empty. The proximity fuse shell sat alone on its table, silent and complete, a monument to a war won not by courage alone but by the industrial multiplication of human brilliance. It would eventually be collected, catalogued, shipped to some American archive where it would gather dust for decades. But its message had already been delivered. The Americans had taught the world a new way to win wars. And Heinrich Voss had been there to witness the lesson.